Dr. John McClernand left his native homeland of Scotland in the late 1700s and found himself in Ireland, where he promptly left, possibly because of the political tumult arising from the Irish Rebellion of 1798. He then proceeded to Philadelphia, staying there a short time before heading west to the Promised Land, talked about in newspapers called Kentucky. While in Kentucky, the physician met a widow named Fatima Seton Cummins. Their first and only child, John Alexander McClernand, was born on May 30th, 1812 in Breckinridge County, Kentucky. The child's ancestry could be traced back to the prominent Scotsman during the reign of Malcolm I of Scotland, but now, with no royal or knightly titles in the United States, John would need to cultivate a life of his own in the frontier of the relatively new country. At the age of 4, the family moved to Shawneetown, Illinois. Not long after settling in Illinois, John's father passed away and his resourceful mother took up the slack and provided for herself and her young son. She provided him with a basic education, and by the age of 16, an Illinois state senator took a liking to the young man and taught him French and Latin, as well as provided him with law books to study from. After 4 years of hard studying, McClernand passed the bar in 1832 at the age of 20. Also in 1832, the Sauk and Fox Native American tribes crossed the Mississippi River to reclaim their lands on the east side of the river, which frightened the communities in Illinois and the territories to the north. The state of Illinois called up the militia to fight what became known as the Black Hawk War, named after the Sauk leader, and McClernand enlisted. In his 3-month service, he became the assistant quartermaster on the staff of Brigadier General Alexander Posey. The only great service John saw during his time in the war was when the general recognized him for carrying dispatches from the general hundreds of miles through hostile territory. When the conflict ended, McClernand's health quickly deteriorated, and to combat his ill health, he began an active life, working as a trader along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. By 1835, he returned to Shawneetown, where he established and edited the first Democratic newspaper in town called the Gallatin Democrat. It didn't last long, so McClernand entered politics, following in the footsteps of many lawyers. Politically, McClernand was a Democrat, and he won a seat in the Illinois legislature in 1836 at the age of 24. 2 other prominent politicians began their political careers in that same governing body and shared that legislative session with McClernand. One was future Senator and presidential hopeful Stephen A. Douglas, and the other was future President Abraham Lincoln. In a largely bipartisan initiative, Whigs and Democrats worked together to hammer out an internal improvements bill to allocate around $8 million to improve roads and rivers, as well as build railroads, all to boost the economy of the state. Jackson's Bank War partially led to the bill's demise that many politicians worked hard to create. McClernand and Lincoln battled back and forth over the existence of the Illinois State Bank. Since McClernand belonged to the Democratic Party, he endorsed the reduction and destruction of central banking practices. After debates in the legislature, Lincoln wrote that McClernand spoke a lot but said very little, but McClernand, through his dedication to the Democratic Party principles, endeared himself to the party. In the 1830s, as a result of the Nat Turner Rebellion and the rise of abolitionism, Southerners began to recall and place restrictions on abolitionists, their societies, and pamphlets, fearing that their actions risked the lives of whites all over the country by riling up African Americans, both free and enslaved. Southern states, as well as northern ones, issued proclamations denouncing abolitionism and their tracts. Illinois took up the debate in the legislature, which forced McClernand to confront the issue of slavery. McClernand's views echoed that of the Illinois House, which reported the abolitionist actions threatened the entire country and denounced their actions as volatile and harmful. McClernand and other legislatures emphasized that the federal Constitution protected slavery, and as long as the states wanted to keep the institution, they possessed that right. After an eventful one term in the legislature, McClernand decided not to run for a second term. His political ally, Thomas Carlin, who ran and won the governorship, offered the office of lieutenant governor to McClernand, but since the Illinois state constitution restricted that office to those 30 years of age or older, McClernand declined. He was only 26. Carlin then appointed him Secretary of State. However, the incumbent Secretary of State, Alexander P. Field, argued that the Illinois Constitution did not give the governor the ability to remove an appointee. McClernand sued, and it went to the Illinois Supreme Court with Abraham Lincoln helping the legal team for Field and Stephen Douglas representing McClernand. The court ruled in favor of Field. Carlin then appointed McClernand to the Illinois and Michigan Canal, and he became its treasurer. As part of the Canal Commission, he held the responsibility, as everyone in that commission did, to not leak information as to the location of the canal to cut down on land speculation. He may have broken his oath to keep the route a secret when he wrote to the director of the Bank of Illinois that land in Lockport, Illinois would double in value, but no clear-cut conspiratorial land speculation could be proven. In 1840, McClernand ran and won election to the Illinois legislature again, and again serving alongside Abraham Lincoln. In this session, McClernand fought against an anti-immigration bill that would disenfranchise unnaturalized aliens residing in Illinois. Immigrants tended to vote Democratic because of their stances on individualism. Whigs tended to want a more homogenized society and saw immigrants as a threat to that. McClernand argued that the bill supported by the Whigs violated the Constitution that allowed white males to vote who resided in the state for longer than 6 months. In his speeches against the bill, he attacked the judicial system of the state, and one of the state Supreme Court justices, Theophilus Smith, challenged McClernand to a duel. Both men agreed, and when McClernand showed up at the designated dueling location, the justice never appeared, resulting in McClernand being declared the man with more honor and thus the winner of the duel. In 1840, McClernand campaigned to re-elect Martin Van Buren as president. He journeyed around the state making speeches and on many occasions ran into Abraham Lincoln, who was campaigning for William Henry Harrison. In 1842, the voters of Gallatin County sent McClernand to a third term as a legislator. When the U.S. Senate seats came open from Illinois, he tried in vain to gain one of those seats. One newspaper explained they believed the reason he could not get the spots was that he was guilty of the sin of residing in the South. That description did not refer to his early life in Kentucky, but to his residency in southern Illinois, which, because of its closeness to the slaveholding states of Kentucky and Missouri, made it an area known for its pro-slavery stances. The area became known as Little Egypt because of its slave population. Illinois barred future introduction of slaves into the state when it entered the Union in 1818, but allowed French slaves and indentured servants who had been brought into the territory to remain in those conditions. It was also not uncommon for slave owners in Kentucky to also own land in Illinois and work their slaves in both states, and as long as the slaves did not reside in the state for 6 months, they were considered in transit and thus not made free. During the 1842-43 legislative session, Illinois debated a bill that would require blacks living or moving through the state to provide proof of freedom or face confinement for 1 year. Gustav Corner objected to the bill, asserting that it infringed on personal liberties, but McClernand countered his argument by saying if the bill did not get passed, southern Illinois especially would be overrun by what he called a most dangerous population. The bill died in committee. Though McClernand lived in a free state, he continued to deal with the slavery questions that consumed the entire country. In May 1843, the 1840 census brought 4 new seats in Congress to the state of Illinois, and McClernand ran for one of those seats as a self-made man, beating his Whig opponent. His friend Stephen Douglas won another one of the seats, and they headed for Washington together. But they weren't alone. Sarah Dunlap from Jacksonville, Illinois, and a close friend to Mary Todd Lincoln, caught McClernand's eye, and in November 1843 they wed, heading to Washington together for John to take his seat in Congress. In 1844, he returned to Illinois to campaign for Democratic President James K. Polk. His oratory skills gained him great notoriety from Democratic newspapers, but derision from Whig newspapers. Nevertheless, Illinois and the nation chose Polk to become president. The mid-1840s saw great debate on the Congressional floor about the fate of Texas and other territory prized by the United States. Like Polk, McClernand was an expansionist and warned against Great Britain taking over the Oregon Territory below the 5440 north latitude. In one of his speeches he stated, "The great mountains of the east and west were the granite bands formed by the almighty hand to bind the numerous states which were spread out in beautiful and glorious prospect over the intervening space together as one firm and cemented union. It is for England to count the cost and dread the consequences of an unjust war with the United States." When President Polk sought authorization from Congress to declare war on Mexico, McClernand voted in support of the declaration. He fully supported the Mexican-American War, which would create more southern states and thus the spread of the institution of slavery. John believed that by Northerners like himself helping expand southern territory, that southern politicians would help him and others gain the 5440 north latitude as the new border between the United States and Great Britain. He was wrong. Polk backed down and accepted the 49th parallel as the border. In 1846, McClernand won a third term in Congress with no opposition. Abraham Lincoln would also take a seat in that Congress, but unlike McClernand, who brought his wife with him to Washington, Lincoln refused to let Mary come with him, even after she asked to be close to her friend Sarah McClernand. Although their wives were friends, McClernand and Lincoln did not see eye to eye politically. McClernand was a staunch expansionist. He stated, "Extension and expansion is the condition of our political existence. To fix arbitrary bounds on the Republic would be to cage the eagle in its upward flight." However, with the country expanding came the question of slavery and how it would be treated in the Western territories. McClernand offered his opinions on the Congressional floor when he stated, "Congress could not constitutionally in any way interfere with the institution of slavery in the slaveholding states. In the case of the territories of the United States, the case is different. In regard to them, the jurisdiction of this government is supreme." His territorial stance on slavery was not uncommon for a Northerner, whether Whig or Democrat, but this would not be his last speech on the subject. David Wilmot introduced an amendment to the bill to authorize payment to Mexico for land acquired in the war. In the amendment, it stated, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of said territory." McClernand voted against the amendment, but realized that Washington politics was beginning to boil. He wrote to his friend Charles Lamphere, the editor of the Illinois State Register, that "we are in a national crisis." He also voted against any such language to be placed in the Democratic platform at the National Convention for the party in the election of 1848. McClernand's friend Stephen Douglas, along with others, constructed what they called popular sovereignty, where a state could choose whether to be free or slave. McClernand liked this idea and saw it as the best way to resolve the territorial disputes about the institution of slavery. He disagreed with the leader of the party, John C. Calhoun, who argued that the government had no right to interfere with citizens bringing slave property into United States territories. In this respect, McClernand clearly became concerned over the fate of the nation and thought that compromise was the best course of action, and that Calhoun's argument was too volatile for the country. McClernand sought a middle ground. In 1848, McClernand was on the ballot for a U.S. Senate seat from Illinois. He came in third place, losing to James Shields. By December 1849, McClernand found himself in a race for the position of Speaker of the House. After multiple tough rounds of balloting, McClernand withdrew since he was 40 votes behind and told his constituents to vote for someone more worthy. Hal Cobb from Georgia became the Speaker of the House. Although he did not attain that position in the House, he and fellow Illinoisan Stephen Douglas would lead the country through one of the most turbulent times prior to the American Civil War. Henry Clay proposed a large omnibus bill that included admitting California as a free state, organizing Utah and New Mexico as territories, and restricting slavery there, and whether to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. The House and Senate floor became a violent place with debates raging in both bodies. McClernand became so concerned that he began carrying 2 pistols and a bowie knife. John, as a chairman of the Committee of the Whole in the House, and Stephen Douglas, as chairman of the Senate Committee on Territories, got to work ironing out a compromise. McClernand's views on slavery, like many in the 19th century, were nuanced. He was against the institution of slavery, but acknowledged that the Constitution protected it, and for that reason he opposed abolitionists who, in his mind, went against the Constitution by seeking to abolish it, even though he spoke openly about being glad to see slavery prohibited everywhere. While men like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster made speeches toward a compromise and did indeed work toward a compromise that became known as the Compromise of 1850, as one of McClernand's biographers stated, the measure that eventually passed both houses was essentially the one drafted by John McClernand and Stephen Douglas. John McClernand feared for the future of the Union. As an ardent supporter of the Constitution, he knew the slavery question had to be settled on the basis of that document. The The problem was one of interpretation, with seemingly irreconcilable differences between the camps. Compromise had to be found, and it was, for a while at least. The fiery orator became a mediator, a negotiator. His role, however, was primarily behind the scenes. In the end, he had achieved little renown. He would announce in that year that he would not seek re-election and leave the House. On his return home aboard a steamboat, a drunken pilot got into an argument with a crewman. The pilot drew a pistol and shot, missing McClernand by just an inch, but powder from the shot was embedded in his face. In 1851, John and Sarah moved to Jacksonville, Illinois, where he dabbled in land speculation, and when the next presidential election came about, he supported Stephen Douglas, but Franklin Pierce got the nomination from the Democratic Party. McClernand expected to get the position of minister to Spain or Mexico, but none of these materialized. In fact, no friend of Douglas got an appointment from Pierce. With politics seemingly in his rear view, McClernand went back to his law practice. In 1854, another political act brought McClernand back into politics, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It basically nullified the Missouri Compromise, which had been the law of the land for over 30 years as to the institution of slavery in the territories. The Kansas-Nebraska Act would allow Kansas and Nebraska to choose its status through popular sovereignty. Stephen Douglas declared that if you called yourself a Democrat but did not support the Kansas-Nebraska Act or popular sovereignty, then you were not a true Democrat. McClernand recoiled at the idea of Douglas using the bill as a sign of party loyalty and spoke out against that very thing within the state of Illinois, along with Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the bill but for different reasons. The Kansas-Nebraska Act brought about Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates argued and attacked one another over the issue of control over the state. In 1856, McClernand moved to Springfield and opened up a law practice with Elliott B. Herndon, the brother of Abraham Lincoln's law partner, William H. Herndon. For the next few years, McClernand opposed Lincoln in court, acted as his co-counsel, and at other times recommended clients to Lincoln. When James Buchanan became the Democratic presidential candidate, McClernand campaigned for him, and when Buchanan won, he thought that he may be named the minister to Russia. Stephen Douglas pushed for him to get that position with Buchanan, but McClernand was passed over. In 1857, slavery again brought McClernand back into the national debate when Kansas submitted a state constitution. Two factions and two capitals emerged in Kansas, the pro-slavery capital at Lecompton and the anti-slavery capital at Topeka. James Buchanan accepted the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution, which went against the anti-slavery majority that now lived in Kansas. Stephen Douglas saw this as a warping of the idea of popular sovereignty and going against the majority rule. McClernand and Douglas battled against the Lecompton Constitution in speeches and newspaper articles. The Senate supported the Lecompton Constitution, but it died in the House. In 1858, Douglas sought re-election for the Illinois Senate seat, and McClernand, being the faithful friend he was, supported him in his campaign. But McClernand could not gain enough support for his own advancement to the House of Representatives. The Illinois State Journal mocked McClernand as having too few friends to get himself elected, and reported that he was so despondent that he may commit suicide. E.L. Baker, the editor of the paper, met McClernand in the town square, and McClernand began to violently beat Baker with his cane. After battering the newspaperman, he drew a pistol from his coat and declared, "If you want to take it up, I'll put a hole through you." A crowd intervened, and the melee stopped. Just as national politics began to hit a boiling point, McClernand became swept up in the political fervor infecting the nation. Thomas Harris, the man who won an election to become the representative from the 6th District of Illinois, died, leaving the seat vacant. McClernand became a candidate to fill that vacancy. After a stiff election with plenty of mudslinging, McClernand defeated his Republican opponent. John defeated his opponent by focusing on the recent raid on Harper's Ferry by John Brown. McClernand characterized his opponent, John Palmer, as an abolitionist and a supporter of Brown's plot. McClernand told the voters that voting for Palmer was equal to declaring war on the Southern people. In Congress and through the states, the Democratic Party began tearing itself apart over sectional differences, and McClernand, along with Douglas, attempted to hold the party together. In the battle for the House Speaker, that split became evident. John got up before Congress and said, "Whether from the North or the South, we are members of the same common party, standing upon the same platform of principles." As the year 1860 pressed on, the Democratic Party held its convention to nominate a candidate for president in the southern city of Charleston, South Carolina. There, the party split again over platform. McClernand and Douglas both supported popular sovereignty to decide a future state status, with the caveat that the Supreme Court could settle slavery disputes in the territories. Delegates from 8 southern states walked out when their support of a plank in the platform to expressly guarantee the right of slavery to expand in the territories unencumbered failed. The Democratic Party would reconvene a few months later in Baltimore, Maryland, where Stephen Douglas became the nominee for the Northern Democrats. John C. Breckinridge became the nominee for the Southern Democrats. McClernand put all of his support behind Douglas in the 4-man race for the White House, with Republican Abraham Lincoln and Constitutional Unionist John Bell rounding out the candidates. McClernand's seat for Congress came up and he again ran for re-election, all the while campaigning for Douglas throughout Illinois. He compared Douglas to Julius Caesar and George Washington and built him up as the only man to save the country from ruin. A newspaper that supported McClernand touted that a vote for McClernand was a vote against equality, abolitionism, Lovejoyism, Lincolnism, and every other foul ism. McClernand won the election, and as soon as Congress convened, the talk of secession and disunion encompassed the Capitol. In a speech to fellow representatives, he declared that he deplored Lincoln's election as a great national calamity, but that he could not agree that his election is sufficient cause for breaking up the country. It was the nation's duty to acquiesce in his election, if not in respect to him, in respect for the people and the Constitution itself. McClernand early in the crisis proposed a resolution that would see one representative from each state come together to find a solution for the disunion crisis. When a Virginia representative put forward a similar resolution, McClernand withdrew his, feeling that having a state contemplating secession propose a similar resolution carried more weight. Neither that resolution, the assembled group by the Senate, or the Crittenden Compromise stopped South Carolina on December 20th from seceding from the Union. John wrote to a friend in Illinois that he and the state should arm themselves in preparation for civil war. When President James Buchanan failed to support Fort Sumter, McClernand chastised him for being weak and bringing ruin to the United States. McClernand and other representatives tried in vain to obtain any compromise. Exhausted and feeling hopeless, John confronted Mississippian William Barksdale, saying, come on, we are ready to meet you and settle it quickly." But the Southern politicians would no longer compromise. He would tell his fellow representatives, "Let us all rally in favor of the integrity of the Constitution and the Union, and that I do not desire war. I would avoid it by all honorable means. Such a war would be fratricidal, unnatural, and most bloody." He then called upon all to merge the partisan in the patriot, and coming up to the altar of the country, generously sacrifice every angry feeling and ambitious aim for the welfare and glory of the country. In a show of bipartisanship, McClernand shook hands with Illinois Republican William Kellogg. When Kellogg stated that he was willing to join with men from all parties to keep the Union together. Some historians point to that moment as the point when McClernand gained great respect from members of both parties, especially when they saw how hard McClernand worked to hash out a deal with both sections. McClernand made it known that party would not stand in the way of country. Back in Illinois, he openly supported Lincoln as the man to bring the country back together, and even though he admitted that him and Lincoln did not believe the same politically, he felt it his duty to help sustain the Union at all costs, even if he had to fight against his own party to do it. Although McClernand and Lincoln were not friends, more so acquaintances that knew each other socially and professionally, John sent a proposal to the new president soon after Lincoln took office, describing what needed to be done militarily to bring the Union back together. First, he suggested a land and amphibious invasion of Texas, perceiving it as the weaker of the Confederate States, to bring it quickly back into the Union. Then the United States should fortify multiple locations along the Mississippi River, including New Madrid, Missouri, Memphis, Tennessee, and Columbus, Kentucky. He was strategically naive, but the proposal demonstrates a lot about his character. One of his biographers wrote, "These proposals revealed several things about John McClernand. First was his brashness. He had no hesitation about proffering his opinion on a subject about which he knew nothing. Second was his assertive leadership. He was a party leader in Illinois and had been extremely influential in Congress. Leadership in formulating strategy was required, and he was eager to provide it. Third was his energy. McClernand engaged in political crises at home and in Washington, yet he could still marshal enthusiasm for military affairs. Fourth was his patriotism. Maintaining the Union was critical. Political differences paled in comparison. Fifth was his confidence in his own influence. He had met with presidents and congressmen. On many occasions his advice had been heeded. He had no reason to believe Lincoln would not heed it. Finally, he showed that he was a man of vision. His overall plan was not one of short-term gain, but of long-term consequence. It was a means to achieve the objective of restoring the Union. The war had to be ended, and the Union preserved. One other character trait would soon become evident, though it was not reflected in his proposals of the spring of 1861. Ambition. Death stalked McClernand in the spring and summer of 1861. In May, his wife Sarah died from tuberculosis. She gave John 6 children before passing away at the age of 36. In June, John's longtime friend Stephen A. Douglas died as well. On June 19th, he and fellow Illinois Democrat Congressman John Logan visited Camp Yates outside of Springfield. There, the two politicians asked the colonel of the 21st Illinois Infantry if they could speak to the men. The colonel agreed, knowing of McClernand's strong stance for the Union. The 21st had signed 30-day enlistments, and those 30 days were up. After the two men gave rousing speeches to the enlisted men, many of them re-enlisted for the 3-year terms. They thanked the colonel for letting them address the soldiers, but neither McClernand nor the colonel would realize how intertwined their lives would become over the next few years. The colonel's name was Ulysses S. Grant. Also around this time, McClernand met with Lincoln and communicated with Secretary of War Simon Cameron about the importance of southern Illinois militarily, as well as the Mississippi River. Because many corn growers in southern Illinois and other Midwestern states sold their crops to the south using the river, the secession of Mississippi and Louisiana created a financial crisis for the farmers of Illinois. He advocated for the government to purchase corn from the farmers to help stabilize the economy in the Midwest. In July, during the Congressional session, the Illinois Congressional delegation met to assemble a list of names of men for Lincoln to appoint as brigadier generals. 2 Illinoisans, John Pope and Stephen Hurlbut, had already received appointments. The delegation proposed 7 more names to Lincoln for appointments. Of those names on the list, Ulysses S. Grant, Benjamin Mayberry Prentice, and John McClernand would receive the appointments. McClernand was a political appointment on the part of Abraham Lincoln. Southern Illinois, known as Egypt throughout the region, produced opposition to the call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Lincoln feared the rebellion would spread into his state, and when McClernand arrived at the White House on August 7th, Lincoln made his reasons known for appointing him a brigadier general. He told McClernand to keep Egypt right side up. Along with those instructions, he issued John a quota of units to raise, including 4 infantry regiments, 4 cavalry companies, and 2 artillery companies. But McClernand would not spend the whole war in Illinois. He would be part of the major invasion of the South in the western theater of the war. Senator Orville Browning, who replaced Stephen Douglas in the Senate after Douglas's death, spoke to Lincoln, General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, and the Secretary of War about McClernand. The Secretary of War sent a letter to the governor of Illinois as a result of his meeting, instructing him to afford McClernand all the facilities in your power for arming and equipping his brigade for service at the earliest date possible. McClernand took this letter to mean that he and his brigade took priority over all Illinois units when it came to getting outfitted for the war. He overstepped his power when he made a deal contracting with British agents to supply his brigade with 4,000 British-made Enfield rifled muskets, citing a letter from the Secretary of War to the Illinois governor giving him the authority to do so. He also obligated the Illinois government to pay for these weapons. McClernand also acted as a politician, even when he took on the role as general. He personally wrote to the quartermaster general to set up a fund of $25,000 for which he could draw from to field his brigade. By the end of August, McClernand and his men would be assigned to the Western Department, commanded by John C. Fremont and headquartered at St. Louis. When McClernand wrote to Fremont about the need of supplies, Fremont informed John that he needed to submit a request to the quartermaster for the Western Department. Undoubtedly, McClernand was taken aback by this type of formality when he was used to being a politician, where he communicated directly with politicians of any position because of his clout. Fremont assigned McClernand to protect in southern Illinois, along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Ulysses S. Grant, now in command of the District of Southeast Missouri, placed his headquarters in southern Illinois. A small squabble between Grant and McClernand emerged when John failed to take command of a post since he was the senior ranking officer. In fairness to McClernand, he had been ordered to occupy that area, not take command of the area. Still, Grant got angry at McClernand's inaction. When Confederate General Leonidas Polk invaded Kentucky and occupied Columbus, this gave the Union the ability to invade the declared neutral state. Grant, with troops from McClernand's force, crossed the river and occupied Paducah, Kentucky. McClernand expertly organized his troops and the transports to make the expedition possible. Grant complimented McClernand by saying, "I must acknowledge my obligations to General McClernand, commanding his force, for the active and efficient cooperation exhibited by him in fitting out this expedition." For the next few months, McClernand coordinated the movement of troops through his post in southern Illinois, equipped soldiers, coordinated with the quartermaster, made sure adequate rations were issued to each soldier, and did general paperwork that kept the army together. His 12-year-old son Edward would join him in the field around this time, gaining a great appreciation and fascination with the army. He did have to deal with his soldiers drinking heavily in the nearby towns, which caused trouble in the ranks. Grant issued an order authorizing McClernand to arrest anyone frequenting the drinking establishments. John wrote to Grant that had his troops been kept in Springfield, like he requested, his troops would not have indulged themselves in the saloons. He also reminded Grant that when he took command of the area, he suggested declaring martial law so that he could shut down those types of businesses, but Grant refused to do so. By November, McClernand would outlaw the sale of alcohol in the city entirely because of the constant problems that arose from soldiers ingesting the spirits. The biggest problem affecting McClernand's command was a lack of weapons. The 4,000 Enfields had yet to arrive, and Fremont had only sent 500 weapons to the brigade since being garrisoned in southern Illinois. What the men did have were old flintlock rifles, either that they brought with them to enlist or were issued from old stock put aside by the state or local municipalities. The problem was that every brigade in the Union suffered from a lack of weapons early in the war, and the fact that McClernand's regiments signed up later than many put them further down on the list of recipients. He did see a little hope that got dashed quickly when the 4,000 rifles arrived from Britain, but the governor could not secure them because too many units and governors of other states sought them out. A reorganization by Grant gave McClernand more troops, demonstrating the confidence Grant and others put in McClernand's abilities. Both McClernand and John Logan renewed their oratory skills when they traveled to a post where a unit refused to re-enlist. After a speech from each man, the entire unit decided to re-enlist for the 3-year stint. In November, McClernand received 28 copies of Hardee's Light Infantry Tactics to help him and the other officers in his brigade to understand the manual of arms, army regulations, and how to drill the troops. During the fall of 1861, Grant journeyed to Springfield and St. Louis, which took him 3 days to accomplish, meeting with politicians and military officials. He left McClernand in command during his absence. As the commander, McClernand canceled all soldiers on hospital detail so they could drill with the rest of the regiments. He was taking his military duties seriously and believed that able-bodied soldiers on hospital detail threatened the integrity of his force by not allowing them to train with the rest of the brigade. This put John in conflict with the medical director, who complained to Grant. When the commander returned, Grant rescinded McClernand's order, but there seems to be no hard feelings between any of the 3 men during that situation. At the beginning of November, Grant finally gave McClernand what he wanted, a taste of battle. The district commander sent his brigades downriver toward the little community of Belmont, where Confederate activity gave great concern to Union authorities in the area. On November 6th, McClernand and his brigade loaded onto transports. By 8:30 the next morning, McClernand and his force disembarked about 3.5 miles north of Belmont. Not knowing the terrain or region, McClernand went with his scouts to observe the landscape over which his men would move. This became a common practice for the general and one that would help him maneuver his troops over vastly different terrains. He would not solely rely on reports, he wanted to see the areas personally. McClernand deployed his men and marched south toward the Confederate camps, but came into contact with Confederate cavalry. Then, after pushing them aside, Confederate infantry massed in their front. McClernand could be found at the head of his brigade, hat in hand, directing his regiments. His horse became wounded, but still carried the general despite other bullets mangling the harness. The general pushed back the Confederate infantry to their camps and then ordered a general charge that sent the Southerners running. The blue troops now occupied the rebel works, raising the United States flag up the flagpole and pilfering the camp for trophies. The pillaging and chaos got so bad that Grant ordered the camp burned. The Union troops celebrated until the enemy began to regroup and counterattack. McClernand led his troops out of the works and fought their way out, but the battle disorganized his troops. John's horse got wounded a second time on the retreat, and a bullet grazed John's head, but the Union brigade made it to safety minus one regiment. Confederates pursued the Union forces and shot at the blue troops boarding the transports. McClernand worried as the boat sped away about the 27th Illinois Infantry. They became disconnected from the brigade during the fight, and after traveling across the battlefield twice, McClernand was unable to locate them. As they steamed up the Mississippi, McClernand ordered the pilot of the transport to dock on the Missouri side of the river. The general did not go far before he met a staff member from the 27th. The regiment boarded the transport and the brigade went back to camp. The Battle of Belmont at best could be considered a draw, but Northern newspapers described it as a loss, asking for Grant to be relieved of command for committing such a blunder. McClernand, on the other hand, gained great notoriety from some of the newspapers and was declared the savior of the day. Still, at least one newspaper accused Grant and McClernand of being cowards in the battle, who did not stay with their men. That statement couldn't be further from the truth. Grant wrote to his father about the Battle of Belmont, saying, "General McClernand acted with great coolness and courage throughout, and proved that he is a soldier as well as a statesman." In his report, he said General McClernand was in the midst of danger throughout the engagement and displayed both coolness and judgment. Although the Battle of Belmont had ended, McClernand dealt with a personal and military situation that emerged from the engagement. It resulted in McClernand's aide-de-camp, Captain Alexander Pulaski, a Polish immigrant, being killed. The general grieved over the loss of such a vital part of his command and a good person. He wrote a condolence letter to the man's widow, informing her that he died as a hero, covered in glory. Miss Pulaski wanted the body brought back to Springfield and tasked Reverend L.P. Clover to recover the body. Because of the military situation, McClernand refused to allow Clover to travel to the battlefield, which turned into a scandalous story about the general not honoring the wishes of a widow of this war. Newspapers who supported McClernand accused Clover of being a secessionist. McClernand wrote to Confederate General Leonidas Polk, the Southern adversary at Belmont, to look for the body. Pulaski was recovered from the field and given a funeral in Springfield on November 12th. McClernand attempted to use his political power to gain the infields he contracted earlier by insisting to Governor Yates that if the men possessed adequate weapons, the engagement would have been more decisive. Not wanting the blood of dead Illinoisans on his hands, Yates agreed to purchase McClernand's infields, but when the agent went to pick them up, the U.S. government declared authority and distribution over all weapons. McClernand's infantry would have to make do with what they had until January, when Grant secured the weapons they needed. McClernand acted as a political choice for Lincoln, who hoped that his appointment to Brigadier General would sway Southern Illinois firmly into the camp of the Union, despite their Southern ties. McClernand deviated from the chain of command when corresponding with the President directly and his other superiors, who kept reminding him that he needed to follow military etiquette. Nevertheless, McClernand attempted to assert his political power that he possessed, particularly in a change in the war objectives. The first Confiscation Act labeling runaway slaves as contraband only intensified the feeling of many Northerners that the war was becoming about fighting slavery. McClernand wrote that discontented Republicans pushing for an end to slavery threatened the integrity of Illinois by attempting to change the objective of the war from preserving the Union to ending slavery. McClernand even supported congressmen in the ranks to resign from the Army to keep their seats in Congress to potentially fight against this change in objective. During the winter of 1861, the department in which McClernand was in got reorganized. Henry Halleck replaced John C. Fremont as McClernand and Grant's commander. Washington wanted action against the Confederates, and in the West, Grant and McClernand gave them action. On January 10, 1862, McClernand and his command made it to Fort Jefferson, Kentucky in an attempt to prevent troops from the western side of the Bluegrass State from reinforcing positions in the middle and eastern portions. Once at Fort Jefferson, McClernand demonstrated great skill and understanding of military operations when he ordered field fortifications thrown up to guard their camp and then coordinated with the naval element to shell the Confederates in Columbus, Kentucky, to conceal the infantry and cavalry's intentions. By January 18th, the expedition ended, and by the 21st, McClernand was back in southern Illinois with his brigade. Grant brewed with ideas for an attack on the Confederate defenses along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. McClernand was given division command and told at the beginning of February to prepare his men for a movement on Fort Henry. His division landed 8 miles downstream from Fort Henry on February 4th at 4:30 a.m. Grant changed his mind as to where his men needed to disembark and ordered McClernand closer to Fort Henry, just 4 miles to the north of the Confederate works. McClernand personally reconnoitered the ground between his camp and the fort. Grant arrived and on board the Cincinnati called together his division commanders, McClernand and Charles F. Smith, as well as Flag Officer Andrew Foote and Captain of the Conestoga, Seth Phelps. Phelps brought aboard a Confederate torpedo he lifted from the river. Officers gathered around to observe while the boat's armorer unscrewed the cap. As the cap loosened, a loud sizzling noise erupted. McClernand and Smith threw themselves on the boat's deck, while Foote and Grant ran for the boat's ladder. The sailors who witnessed this event roared with laughter, for the noise had been only the gases generated by the wet powder in the torpedo. Once the senior commanders of the expedition had composed themselves, they all had a hearty laugh over the incident. Grant planned for the assault to begin on February 6th at 11 a.m. McClernand would move down the east bank of the river and place his brigades between Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, just a few miles away to prevent the former from being reinforced by the latter. Smith's brigades would attack on the west bank to capture Fort Hyman, while Foote shelled the works. In Grant's directive, he ordered McClernand to move with the guidance of Lieutenant Colonel McPherson. McClernand became worried that Grant meant that McPherson would be usurping his command and asked Grant to clarify the order. McClernand had grown suspicious of West Pointers, probably because they represented a challenge to his military and political authority, them being considered more skillful than he was in military operations. Grant cleared up the matter by telling McClernand that McPherson was simply to guide McClernand to the correct spot along the road, not to command his troops. The heavy rains made McClernand's march slow. He was supposed to prevent the rebels from escaping, but did not reach the destination until 2:30 p.m. In the meantime, 2,500 Confederates evacuated Fort Henry before it capitulated. McClernand's men would be the first troops inside the fort. McClernand renamed it Fort Foote in honor of Flag Officer Foote, something he had no authority to do. Grant ignored the name change, although McClernand kept using it in his correspondence. Grant met with his commanders and they decided to press on without delay to Fort Donelson. McClernand's men took the lead on February 11th and reached them on the 12th. John's division left open a gap on the right between his rightmost brigade and the river, so he ordered that flank to dig in. A significant creek separated his left from Charles Smith's division. Both divisions were in a precarious situation, but each division commander ordered attacks without approval from Grant. Both failed. That night, 3 inches of snow fell, covering the shivering Union soldiers who abandoned their overcoats and blankets on the march from Fort Henry to Donelson. Grant quickly organized troops to fill the gap between McClernand and Smith, hoping to mostly cut off the Confederate garrison while his gunboats pounded the Confederates into submission. At 5 a.m. on February 15th, the rebels came out of their works on the Union right and delivered a devastating attack to McClernand's division. John sent word to Lew Wallace in the center to send what help he could to stabilize the Union line that was near its breaking point as the Confederates made repeated assaults against McClernand's line. For over 6 hours, McClernand fought a stubborn withdrawal with the help of Lew Wallace before Grant found his army on the verge of annihilation. By mid-afternoon, McClernand's command had been bloodied and now mostly ineffective. It would be Lew Wallace who, with help from McClernand, would lead a counterattack constructed by Grant to send the rebels back into their works. But before the counterattack could begin, the rebels, through miscommunication, pulled back to where they had began their assault early that morning. The next day, part of the garrison escaped, leaving Simon Bolivar Buckner to ask for surrender terms from Grant. The Union commander would accept nothing but unconditional surrender. Again, with breaking military protocol, McClernand wrote personally to Lincoln informing him of the actions taken by him and his command in the battle. His highly colorful words made his division stand out above the others, and he slighted some of his fellow division commanders. Nevertheless, McClernand was becoming an effective and capable military commander. He held his division together despite vicious assaults by the enemy and allocated support troops appropriately to the areas of greatest need. His abilities were only improving, but he still fashioned himself a politician, even while a general. In February 1862, the Union made significant headway in Tennessee. Grant and McClernand captured both Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, forcing the Confederacy to fall back or risk being cut off. As a result of the capture of those forts, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston, whose command occupied Bowling Green, Kentucky, moved south, first occupying and then abandoning Nashville. McClernand, still new to military etiquette, made some mistakes as his men guarded the roads between the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers. In his instructions to his brigades, he told them to confiscate any enemy property. The word any got him in trouble with Grant and Halleck because all laws passed about the confiscation of property contained specifics as to what the U.S. government considered enemy property. Grant reminded McClernand of that breach in the law, and McClernand clarified his orders to his men. McClernand also complained to Grant about the large amount of picket duty assigned to his division, complaining about the men's workload. Grant, one who served in the Army and fought in the Mexican-American War, assured McClernand that a few days' work would not exhaust the men, and if McClernand was so concerned, make sure the men assigned to that duty had not participated in the battle. By early March, the Union command structure became confusing in the West, and the Army, including McClernand, suffered. Halleck, after complaining about Grant to his superiors, relieved Grant of command and placed Charles F. Smith in command of Grant's army. McClernand knew that he outranked Smith as a brigadier and brought that to the attention of Halleck. However, Washington began a series of promotions involving Smith, but they also involved McClernand. McClernand and some of his staff of the division wrote a letter to Grant speaking of his great success and lamenting his departure from the army. At this point, although squabbles occurred between the two men, McClernand and Grant respected one another. Before he left, Grant ordered McClernand to move with two of his brigades up the Tennessee River and to destroy vital railroads up to Corinth. Halleck changed McClernand's orders, and by mid-March the whole army was moving up the Tennessee, and McClernand and his division occupied Savannah, Tennessee. As word came to the Union Army that the Confederacy was massing their forces at Corinth, McClernand and other divisions encamped outside of Pittsburg Landing, between the landing and Shiloh Church. Grant took back command of the army, relieving Smith. Grant's headquarters were at Savannah, so he placed Smith in command of Union forces at Pittsburg Landing. When Smith attempted to give McClernand orders, McClernand recoiled at the subordinate telling him what to do, and immediately informed Grant. Smith also wrote to Grant to clear up the matter. To solve this problem, with no report as to who outranked who from Washington, Grant simply moved his headquarters to Pittsburg Landing to avoid placing anyone in command of the forces there. Grant would receive a report from the Secretary of War as to the list of promotions, and yes, Smith did get recommended for promotion to Major General first, but the promotion date for both men to Major General occurred on the same day, so McClernand indeed outranked Smith. On the night of April 5th, some advanced Union regiments became concerned about possible Confederate attack, yet most units did not fortify their locations. Early on the morning of April 6th, 4 Confederate corps unleashed a devastating assault against the Union forces. Pockets of resistance in the divisions of McClernand, Sherman, Hurlbut, Prentiss, and W.H.L. Wallace fought hard, but they were forced to fall back closer to the landing. As always, McClernand could be found at the front of his division, instilling courage in his men's hearts, directing where additional ammunition should go, and placing regiments where they could best hurt the enemy. No matter the bravery of their leader, McClernand's divisions had to fall back. At one point, McClernand and Sherman launched a counter-assault to stall the Confederate attackers. His bravery did not lead him to unnecessary risk of his men's lives. When the situation at one location became too hazardous, he quickly ordered his men to withdraw to a better position, where they held out until that situation became too untenable. Sherman and McClernand worked well together, providing great communication, and worked together to keep their divisions, for the most part, intact. As one of his biographers stated, If the army was defeated, it would not be because of the political general John Alexander McClernand. By the end of April 6th, Grant, with help from his staff and division commanders, created a stable defensive line near the landing. The soldiers of both armies slept on their arms in a cold rain. The next morning, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard awoke to gunfire. Grant and his division commanders launched their own massive counterassault against the successful Confederates. With help from the newly arrived division of Lew Wallace, McClernand and Sherman pushed the left flank of the Confederate army back to the Shiloh church. The first day went to the Confederacy, but the second went to the Union, due in great part to the ability of McClernand to organize and place his troops effectively. McClernand went back to his headquarters tent he had abandoned the day before. He found 2 dead Confederate soldiers, one on his field desk and one in his cot. The 2-day battle cost over 24,000 casualties. McClernand's division lost about 25% of its strength. After the battle, the army stayed put, choosing not to pursue the Confederates. While they encamped on the banks of the Tennessee River, McClernand and the army got a visit from Governor Yates of Illinois. He brought along a host of surgeons, nurses, and medical supplies to help with the horrendous scenes of suffering taking place at Pittsburg Landing. While there, he met with McClernand, and the two talked at length. Grant, probably hearing word of officers, including McClernand, bypassing the chain of command and communicating directly with his superiors, issued a general order to follow the chain of command for communication. Although McClernand repeated the order to his subordinates, it did not stop him from ignoring the order and communicating directly with Lincoln about the Battle of Shiloh and telling the President that Grant made a mistake not pursuing the Confederate Army. When the Union Army did pursue by late April, Halleck reorganized the Army so that McClernand now commanded a corps, the Reserve Corps for the Army of the Tennessee. His troops would follow behind the main body in their advance on the fortified town of Corinth, Mississippi. Corinth came under siege, but McClernand did little more than observe any engagements that resulted from the besieged town. After the capture of Corinth, McClernand operated behind Union lines, securing and building bridges, and even sending one of his divisions as far away as Memphis to guard against Confederate attacks. Command structure problems created chaos in McClernand's life after the fall of Corinth. Grant directed him to take control of the area between Union City, Tennessee on the Kentucky border to the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, basically encompassing all of western Tennessee with only one division. Before McClernand could act on Grant's orders, Halleck gave him orders. Stuck in between the two generals, wanting him to do vastly different tasks, he simply asked for Halleck to clarify what he was to do. Halleck told him to ignore Grant's orders and march to Grand Junction to protect the railroad. On June 30th, Halleck sent word to McClernand to move his division to Washington, D.C. Robert E. Lee had just pushed McClellan away from the gates of Richmond, so Halleck wanted to protect the capital. McClernand got one brigade headed toward the capital before the Secretary of War called off the movement. By July, the command structure changed again, with Grant becoming commander of the District of West Tennessee. McClernand now commanded the District of Jackson, Tennessee, and would answer directly to Grant, especially now that Halleck was sent to Washington. After Shiloh and Corinth, the Union High Command split up the forces under Ulysses S. Grant to various locations around Tennessee, forcing the Union commander to stretch out the forces he did possess across West Tennessee, the district under his command. This also put Grant on the defensive with no major force to launch an invasion or act aggressively. McClernand sought to get out from under Grant and petitioned politicians and the Union War Department to be given an independent command or be transferred east with McClellan at the head of a corps. While commanding his segment of West Tennessee, he guarded the junction of the Tennessee and Ohio Railroad with the Memphis and Charleston Railroad. In late July, Confederate cavalry under Joseph Wheeler launched a week-long raid with about 500 horsemen into McClernand's area, but the Illinoisan could do little but pursue him with the little cavalry he possessed under his command. For a week, Wheeler burned cotton and railroad bridges, tore up rail lines, and generally raised havoc. McClernand sent numerous dispatches to Grant and Logan apprising them of the location of the Confederate cavalry, but the 60-mile-wide front he was expected to guard with such few troops prevented him from concentrating and stopping the raid. Wheeler made it back into Mississippi relatively unhurt in early August, having caused a great deal of damage. After the raid, McClernand again wrote to Senator Orville Browning to help get he and his men sent to the Eastern Theater. He also wrote to Abraham Lincoln, seeking a leave of absence. Again, McClernand broke the chain of command by bypassing his superiors and communicating directly with the President. Halleck rebuked McClernand for this action, telling him that he violated Army regulations. McClernand did not take the warning to heart. Also around this time, McClernand and Grant got into some disagreements, furthering the divide between the two men. A colonel came into McClernand's district and investigated the destruction of government property, a role that McClernand felt was his, not someone from outside his division. Then allegations of not following orders that would have reduced or stopped the Confederate raid got leveled at McClernand, who fought back against those accusations. When Major General Edward Ord came into McClernand's area in West Tennessee, McClernand asked Grant under whose authority Ord was there. Grant corrected McClernand that his generals did not command territory, but troops, and that all soldiers under the district of West Tennessee were under himself. When Brigadier General James B. McPherson, the superintendent of railroads for Grant, found that McClernand complained to Grant that private goods were being shipped by rail in preference to military stores, McPherson replied that McClernand himself had requested on 2 occasions for private goods to be shipped by rail, and that as superintendent of railroads, he worked diligently to keep private goods from being smuggled on board. In the last sentence of his response to Grant about McClernand, McPherson wrote that he, in future, shall pay no attention to communications or complaints written by officers who know nothing about the circumstances, and who misstate facts or attempt to convey false impressions. McClernand now had an enemy in McPherson. At the end of August 1862, McClernand got his wish to return to Illinois, under the auspices of helping to recruit more soldiers for the Union war effort and organize troops coming into the ranks. Lincoln called for around 300,000 more troops to fight the war in July, and over 25,000 would come from Illinois. The governor as well as McClernand himself felt he could offer assistance in getting more men to join the war effort. He returned to Illinois a hero and quickly went about sending aides to the Congressional districts to help organize the troops mustered into service, giving them training schedules and helping them prepare the officers for what duties would be expected of them in the field. In Springfield, McClernand was given a hero's welcome, and when he went to Chicago to promote enlistment, he made a speech where he said, "Any commander who relies wholly on strategy must fail. We want the right man to lead us, a man who will appoint a subordinate officer on account of his merits and not because he is a graduate of West Point. Neither Caesar nor Cromwell were graduates of West Point." McClernand found faults with serving under West Pointers and did not like Army regulations, at least when it came to the chain of command. He communicated with Lincoln, breaking with Army regulations, to make sure he received the credit he deserved. He felt that his talents and abilities got lost in the Army reports sent through the chain of command. His suspicion of West Pointers is more difficult to understand, but one reason is that he felt they got more of the recognition for their roles in battles than political appointees like him. While in Illinois, he got the opportunity to travel to Washington and meet with cabinet members to discuss the war. In a meeting with himself, Governor Yates, and the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, McClernand discussed opening up the Mississippi River and launching a major offensive to do so. The Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, asked Lincoln about the Illinois general, and the President responded that while McClernand was brave and capable, he was too desirous to be independent of everybody else. Nevertheless, McClernand continued to garner political favor for his military strategies for opening up the Mississippi River, which would help out his state of Illinois, since the Confederacy's blocking of the Mississippi River forced Midwestern farmers to sell to Eastern markets that now charged a high rate for freight passing by rail and by boat. McClernand even traveled with Lincoln to the Antietam battlefield to visit McClellan. Along the journey and once they returned to Washington, McClernand convinced the cabinet members and the President to give him an independent command. Lincoln gave him orders to organize soldiers in Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa for an expedition to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi. However, the orders conveyed to McClernand gave Grant authority over those troops and put other restrictions on him, so it wasn't exactly an independent command, but McClernand thought himself under the direct authority of Lincoln, not Grant. McClernand left Washington on October 21st, bound for the Midwest to organize the expedition. He began sending troops as they were organized to Memphis to start the expedition. Word came to Grant about such an operation and asked his superior, Henry Halleck, if these troops were under his purview or if they were for some special assignment. Halleck told him, "You have command of all troops sent to your department and have permission to fight the enemy where you please." Over the next 2 months, a series of telegrams and personal discussions between Grant, Sherman, Halleck, Lincoln, Stanton, McClernand, Yates, and Browning as to who commanded the expedition traversed the telegraph wires. Grant and McClernand each thought their authority compromised by the mission of the other. On December 17th, McClernand got word from Secretary of War Stanton that the operations being in General Grant's department, it is designed to organize all the troops of that department in 3 Army Corps, the 1st Army Corps to be commanded by you and assigned to the operations on the Mississippi, under the general supervision of the general commanding the department. General Halleck is to issue the order immediately. This reply dashed McClernand's hope of being given an independent command. The next day, McClernand was made aware that he was now in command of the 13th Army Corps under Grant. While in Springfield, McClernand performed a significant and important service to the Union. In about 3 months, he organized and fielded 52 infantry regiments, 5 cavalry regiments, and 6 artillery companies for the upcoming campaign, an enormous feat in such a short amount of time. Miscommunication, or, as McClernand believed, conspiracy, prevented him from taking command of his forces assembled at Memphis earlier than he did. At the end of December, McClernand departed Illinois for Memphis, with his new wife now in tow. He married Minerva Dunlap, the sister of his deceased wife, before he left the state. When he arrived at Memphis, he found the troops he had sent to that location gone with Sherman on the expedition down the Mississippi. He departed Memphis on December 30th to take command of the 13th Army Corps in its actions against Vicksburg. On his way down the Mississippi River, McClernand stopped at Helena, Arkansas, to confer with the commander of the Eastern District of Arkansas, Brigadier General Willis A. Gorman. The subject of Arkansas Post came up. The French established the location in the 1600s as a trading post on the Arkansas River, and it grew and diminished over the years as Arkansas became a state in the Union. By the Civil War, Confederate forces used it as a base to attack Union forces, particularly ones moving up and down the Mississippi River. On January 3, 1863, McClernand, Sherman, and Admiral David Dixon Porter met aboard Porter's flagship to discuss operations against Arkansas Post. Accounts vary on how the meeting went, but no matter which account you read, the conversation got heated between the 3 men. In the end, McClernand would command the operations against the Confederate post. The next day, McClernand issued General Orders No. 1, in which he assumed command of the Army of the Mississippi, a designation that he gave it. The War Department did not recognize the name, and he named 2 corps within it, each with 2 divisions, one commanded by William T. Sherman and the other commanded by Brigadier General George Washington Morgan. Confederate forces demonstrated through the capture of steamboats and barges what a strongly held post upriver from the Mississippi could do to the Union war effort. For the most part, Sherman and McClernand believed that Arkansas Post posed a threat to any operation against Vicksburg, and thus fully endorsed its capture and destruction. The Confederacy's departmental system ran afoul when it came to the Mississippi River. On the east side of the river, Joseph E. Johnston commanded that department, but on the west side, Theophilus Holmes commanded. Both men answered to Richmond, limiting their ability to coordinate attacks or work together to stall or inhibit Union operations along the Mississippi River. The limited communication and coordination would allow the Union to operate effectively against one or the other. Similar to the Confederate problems of working with other departments, Arkansas Post was in the Department of the Missouri under Major General Samuel R. Curtis. McClernand would have to work with Curtis in this operation. The big difference between the Confederacy and the Union's departmental system was that in this instance, the 2 departments fully cooperated with one another. Curtis took full advantage of the major push against Arkansas Post to move his command to capture Little Rock, an objective he was unable to perform because of the threat that Confederate forces in Arkansas would concentrate against him. With 2 Union armies operating in Arkansas, this took pressure off both commands and put more pressure on the already diminished Confederate fighting force in the state. While formulating his plan and coordinating troops for the operation, McClernand wrote to Lincoln encouraging him to relieve Henry Halleck of command. The Illinois general called Halleck incompetent and biased against those without West Point training. McClernand did not inform Grant of his plan for the expedition until January 8th. On January 11th, Grant wrote back in a blistering letter telling him that he disapproved of the operation, that it would not help the campaign against Vicksburg, and to return to Milliken's Bend on the Mississippi River to await reinforcements to move on Vicksburg. But it was too late. McClernand's expedition had already started, and Confederate attacks in northern Mississippi inhibited communication, preventing McClernand from getting the order. By January 9th, the expedition reached a point just 3 miles from Arkansas Post. Before dawn the next day, men began disembarking. Confederate Brigadier General Thomas J. Churchill commanded about 5,000 men in the fort, with 8 and 9-inch artillery pieces, and a series of trenches and rifle pits running west from the fort. McClernand possessed a little over 30,000 men to perform the operation, and all of them made it to dry ground by midday. McClernand personally reconnoitered the ground over which his men would march, with Sherman's corps in the lead and Morgan's men behind. The plan relied on Sherman marching around the fort and Morgan holding them in place from the north side. Quickly, Sherman's command became bogged down in the swamp. McClernand proved flexible in his planning and was able to adapt to the developing situation. Instead of marching around the fort, Sherman would anchor his right on a bayou to the west, and Morgan would anchor his left on the Arkansas River. McClernand worked with Porter to clear Confederates from rifle pits and also conceal the movements of the infantry. The men slept on the field that night, knowing that the assault would commence the next day. By 11:20 a.m., both Morgan and Sherman confirmed to McClernand that the respective corps were in place and ready to launch the assault. At around 1 p.m., the gunboats fired their volleys to signal the beginning of the attack. After a 30-minute bombardment, Morgan and Sherman's men attacked the fort, and by 5 p.m., Arkansas Post was captured. It resulted in the capture of 4,791 Confederate prisoners, and the Confederacy lost 60 killed and 75 to 80 wounded. McClernand lost 134 killed, 898 wounded, and 29 missing. Conflict emerged when McClernand assigned Morgan the responsibility of commanding the fort, while Sherman commanded the outside. Sherman believed that since he had lost more troops in the fight, he should be in command of it, even though Morgan's men were the first inside the fort. Porter, after the battle, continued to slander McClernand in his report to the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He accused McClernand of being nowhere near the front and being uncommunicative. Both accusations were absolutely false, but it demonstrates that McClernand had enemies in the army that would completely falsify information to make the political general look bad. After the battle, McClernand ordered the burial of the dead and the destruction of the fort itself. Curtis and Gorman wanted to know whether he would continue on to Little Rock. McClernand asked Porter to journey up the Arkansas River and see if they could make it to the state capital. After journeying 12 miles, Porter found the river too shallow, so a movement was out of the question. McClernand thought it a good idea to work with Curtis to capture the capital, but thought his attack on Arkansas Post was meant to divert attention away from Little Rock to allow Curtis to capture it. After the capture, McClernand received the letter from Grant ordering him back to Milliken's Bend. The letter was disappointing, but McClernand obeyed the order and began making his way down the Arkansas River after demolishing the fort. McClernand responded to Grant's order by writing a letter to Abraham Lincoln. In it, he wrote, "I believe my success here is gall and wormwood to the clique of West Pointers who have been persecuting me for months. How can you expect success when men controlling the military destinies of the country are more chagrined at the success of your volunteer officers than the very enemy beaten by the latter in battle? Something must be done to take the hand of oppression off citizen soldiers whose zeal for their country has prompted them to take up arms, or all will be lost. Do not let me be destroyed, or, what is worse, dishonored, without a hearing. How can General Grant, at a distance of 400 miles, intelligently command the army with me? He cannot do it. It should be made an independent command, as both you and the Secretary of War, as I believe, originally intended." In his response to Grant, he said, "I take the responsibility of the expedition against Post Arkansas, and had anticipated your approval of the complete signal success which crowned it rather than your condemnation. Had I remained idle and inactive at Milliken's Bend with the army under my command until now, I should have felt myself guilty of a great crime. Rather had I accepted the consequences of the imputed guilt of using it profitably and successfully upon my own responsibility. The officer who, in the present strait of the country, will not assume a proper responsibility to save it is unworthy of public trust. With McClernand being the senior commander in the area, Grant had two options: replace McClernand with the next officer in line, or take command personally. Although he wrote up an order to remove McClernand, he decided to take command of the operation himself. The stage was set for McClernand and Grant to butt heads again. Ulysses S. Grant, bent on securing the Mississippi River for the Union, mulled over multiple plans for the capture of Vicksburg. Although it was not his favorite plan, the year previous another Union commander attempted to build a canal across the DeSoto Peninsula to bypass the city and safely transport men, gunboats, and supplies to the south side of Vicksburg. He decided to continue the canal, mostly to keep from sitting idle all spring. For this job, he chose McClernand. The politician turned general directed Sherman to start work on the canal. To see to the safety of the men, he ordered a reconnaissance of the area and placed guards along the canal's path. The closest major threat on the west side of the river lay about 40 miles away. Confederates still held much of the river below Vicksburg, so McClernand placed artillery downriver from the city to interfere with the river travel that aided the rebel war effort. McClernand had hardly been on the job for 5 days when the rains began to come down. He reported on January 26th that the heavy rains led to 3 breaks in the levee aiding in the canal's construction. Confederate guerrillas also plagued digging crews as they toiled away in the swamps. McClernand dispatched troops to stand guard as the crews continued their work. He worked effectively with Admiral Porter to protect parties of men in search of food, including fresh beef in the Louisiana countryside. He remained in constant communication with Grant regarding his efforts to comply with the order to build the canal. During this early stage of the project, Colonel Warren Stewart, a member of McClernand's staff, was killed. McClernand wrote to Governor Yates and asked him to bury the man with full military honors in the plot next to his in the cemetery in Springfield, and also included a blank check to the governor to cover any and all expenses associated with fulfilling his request. Also in January, Grant's authority expanded. He now basically commanded both sides of the Mississippi River, in Mississippi as well as in Arkansas. McClernand challenged some of Grant's actions around this same time. Grant issued orders directly to Sherman and other subordinates to McClernand, without going through the proper channels. McClernand wrote to Grant accurately informing him that by him directly communicating with officers under his direct supervision, Grant made him ignorant of vital information. He also stated that the Army cannot have 2 commanders. McClernand was still operating as though he commanded the entire river expedition, and when Grant formally took command of all operations along the waterway, it knocked McClernand back down to Corps Command. Again, he thought this went against the presidential directive for him to operate against Vicksburg along the river, making him feel upstaged by Grant. The directive by the president contained a caveat that gave Grant ultimate authority over operations in that area, so McClernand had no legal standing. Grant tasked McClernand with garrisoning the west bank of the river, giving him 7,000 more men in order to complete the task. Still, the Illinois politician attempted to get out from under his commander and exercise independent command. He wrote to Grant and Lincoln about operating against Arkadelphia, Arkansas, knowing the area acted as a supply depot for Confederate forces west of the Mississippi. He also asked the president to clarify who possessed authority over the Vicksburg campaign. Lincoln ignored the correspondence. Grant objected to the plan because it would take vital resources away from his operations against Vicksburg. As the Corps toiled away in the Louisiana swamps, disease began to run its course through the camps. Making the job of smallpox and malaria easier was the fact that soldiers did not keep their camps clean. Plus, lax regulations regarding hospitals resulted in substandard care. Upon hearing about this, McClernand ordered all hospitals under the purview of the division quartermasters. Officers were using hospital tents and buildings as personal quarters and kitchens, which McClernand quickly brought to an end. Disease still persisted in the camps, but it did get progressively better when the soldiers implemented McClernand's directives. By late March, Grant sought another way to get his army south of Vicksburg. McClernand would take the lead on an expedition from Richmond, Louisiana to New Carthage, Louisiana, then eventually to Hard Times across from Grand Gulf. He took 2 divisions and encountered only small Confederate resistance, informing Grant that the route was made difficult by the bayous, but could be used to march the army to the Mississippi River, south of Vicksburg. McClernand ordered the building of bridges and corduroy roads to facilitate the transportation of men and goods across the watery landscape. He also directed telegraph lines to be strung along the route to ensure the quick transmission of information. Despite the outward appearance, the McClernand-Grant feud continued to simmer. Behind the general's back, McClernand wrote that Grant was a drunk and could be incapacitated after a drunken bender. McClernand's corps moved to hard times in preparation for the movement across the Mississippi River to attack the fortifications around Grand Gulf. The gunboats and transports steamed past the fortifications at Vicksburg and Grand Gulf. The fortifications at Grand Gulf were too formidable to take with direct assault, so Grant directed McClernand to move to Disharoon's plantation south of Grand Gulf and from there be transported by Porter's transports to Bruinsburg, Mississippi. On April 30, 1863, McClernand and his command reached the east side of the Mississippi River, a feat they had struggled for the past 4 months to accomplish. On their way to Port Gibson, a small Confederate force confronted McClernand's corps, but the corps commander had no way of knowing the exact size of the enemy force in front of them. Grant ordered McClernand to take the infantry and artillery over, anticipating a guarded beachhead, but once McClernand's command began moving along the roads to Port Gibson, the lack of cavalry prevented him from knowing what lay ahead of his marching columns. The Confederates massed a little over 1,000 men to combat the 13,000-man corps of McClernand. They occupied good ground, and the tangled forest and bayous hid their true numbers. When Grant arrived on the scene, he even called up for reinforcements, thinking that the major enemy force lay just in front of the Union lines. When McClernand ordered a general advance, the Confederates began to give way, but not without stubborn resistance. Aides to Grant encouraged the army commander to congratulate McClernand, but Grant refused, still fuming over McClernand's questioning of his authority as well as other interactions. When night came, the Union soldiers bedded down, and McClernand prepared for an assault the next morning. When daylight came, McClernand found no enemy. They left during the night. The Union soldiers marched into Port Gibson and set up repairing bridges destroyed by Confederate forces that would lead them to Jackson. With the bridge completed, for the first time in over a month, McClernand's corps did not lead the Army of the Tennessee. McPherson's corps would push further into Mississippi, while McClernand's command recuperated in Port Gibson. Confederate Commander John Pemberton knew the noose was tightening around his installations around Mississippi. He moved his headquarters from Jackson to Vicksburg to facilitate faster communication and instructed Grand Gulf to be abandoned. The Union Army now pushed further into Mississippi, using the Big Black River to their north and Bayou Pierre to the south to screen their movements. Charles Dana, a former journalist for the Chicago Tribune, now Special Commissioner for the War Department, journeyed with Grant's command to provide information to the Secretary of War about various generals and campaigns. Although he came to like Grant, Dana criticized McClernand at every turn. He consistently derided the politician as slow in moving his troops and described him as almost inept in his abilities. Dana let personal feelings get in the way of correct reporting. McClernand was not a perfect general, but he followed Grant's orders in the campaign and met success after success in his battles against Confederate forces. Nevertheless, the derogatory statements made their way to the White House, and they would continue to do so through the campaign. As the Army of the Tennessee moved between the Big Black River and Bayou Pierre, McClernand guarded the Union left flank, the flank with the highest likelihood of being attacked. John Pemberton, the Confederate commander at Vicksburg, concentrated most of his troops around the river city, and if he attacked the marching Union columns, it would be McClernand's troops he would encounter. On the march, the Union Army and Corps commanders got word that Joseph E. Johnston was arriving at Jackson with reinforcements and took command of all Confederate forces around the Mississippi capital. Rumors of a strong Confederate force at Jackson became more certain when on May 12th, James McPherson's corps fought and drove back Confederate forces at Raymond, Mississippi. McPherson commanded the right flank of the Union Army, which signaled to Grant that Jackson needed to be the next strategic goal. McClernand's corps had turned north by that point and were fairly close to Edwards Station, where around 20,000 Confederates were concentrating. In a display of great military skill, McClernand withdrew his corps in the face of the enemy and marched to Raymond, where Grant ordered him to act in a supporting role to Sherman and McPherson, who were to take the capital. When the two Union corps made it to Jackson, they only encountered rearguard elements of the retreating rebel forces who evacuated the city. Grant acted to prevent the linking up of Johnston with Pemberton and quickly dispatched McClernand to capture and hold the town of Bolton, which lay along the most direct route between Vicksburg and Jackson. Grant then issued orders for McClernand to press west to fill out the strength of the Confederate forces massing at Edwards Station. On May 16th, McClernand issued specific and detailed orders to his divisions, so that each commander knew the strategic objective. His 5 divisions moved along 3 different routes at a distance where each could support the other if they engaged with the enemy. Only pieces of McPherson's command were at hand to give support when McClernand's 13th Corps found the enemy at about 9 a.m. McPherson requested that Grant come to the front, probably because he detested answering to McClernand and had no faith in the politician-turned-general. Grant would arrive at around 10 a.m. on the northern part of the battlefield. McClernand's orders from Grant had been to move cautiously and not bring on a general engagement, but now that a full-scale battle was erupting in his front, he was skeptical of what to do. 2.5 hours after Grant arrived on the scene, the commanding general issued the orders for McClernand to attack. McClernand jumped at the chance to unleash his corps against the rebels and ordered all of his divisions to attack the enemy vigorously. However, on McClernand's left, Andrew J. Smith and his division didn't move. His inactivity resulted in the Confederates shifting regiments from that front to engage with the aggressive attacks in the center and the rebel left near Champion Hill. McClernand took a lot of criticism immediately afterward and in the post-war period for the lack of aggressiveness on Smith's part and the fact it took until around 2:30 p.m., 2 hours after Grant issued the orders to attack, for him to organize his own divisions to follow the orders. However, McClernand acted as promptly as he could. Although his divisions were somewhat close together, the thick underbrush and terrain prevented couriers from taking direct routes to the division commanders. They had to travel along a 10-mile route to deliver the orders, which took time. 2 hours was as fast as possible for McClernand to follow those orders. Nevertheless, Pemberton was defeated at Champion Hill, but many point to the lack of aggression on McClernand's left for allowing Pemberton to get away. The Confederate commander retreated about 10 miles to the Big Black River Bridge and prepared for battle. The next day, McClernand's force easily swept the Confederate defenders aside, capturing many and pushing on towards Vicksburg. On May 19th, McClernand's corps arrived on the outskirts of that river fortress and began shelling the Confederate works. Grant got to work as well. His corps were under orders to push forth cautiously and prepare for a general attack along the line at 2 p.m. He hoped that with the infantry attack, along with artillery fire from the gunboats on the river, he could pound them into submission, since he had demoralized them by winning repeated victories on his way to Vicksburg. At 2 p.m., the artillery rounds signaled the time of attack. The whole army moved forward, and although some got close to the entrenchments, all were driven back. The total Union loss was over 900. The rebels were not as demoralized as Grant thought. The Army commander planned for another assault to take place on the 22nd. Like the first, it was to take place along a broad front. McClernand objected to such an attack and submitted his objection in writing to Grant. He insisted that if an attack was to be made, that they concentrate their forces along a critical point along the rebel works, but Grant waved off that idea. At dawn on May 22nd, the Union artillery opened on the Confederate earthworks, and at 10 a.m. the Union troops stepped off. McClernand focused his troops on the entrenchments around the railroad redoubt, and although confusion began to spread along the Union line, McClernand's men planted their flags on that earthwork. McClernand knew that the Confederates would launch a counterattack to take back their fortifications, so he asked Grant if he could order McPherson to launch his own attack. It would make a diversion, and then he could secure a better foothold on the Confederate works. Grant basically told him he needed to seek support within his own corps rather than rely on the troops of another. It remains evident from the correspondence between the 3 corps commanders and the Army commander that Grant simply did not believe McClernand had gained the significant ground that he claimed. 2 of his brigades were in possession of 2 forts, but Confederate guns in the rear were wreaking havoc on the Union soldiers. Finally, Grant relented and sent 1 division from McPherson's corps to support McClernand, but it was too late. It was growing dark, and Confederate counterattacks drove McClernand's men away from the entrenchments. In Grant's report to Halleck, he wrote, "General McClernand's dispatches misled me as the real state of facts and caused much of this loss. He is entirely unfit for the position of corps commander, both on the march and on the battlefield. Looking after his corps gives me more labor and infinitely more uneasiness than all the remainder of my department. 2 days after the failed attack, it was reported that Grant determined to relieve McClernand of command when Vicksburg fell. It wasn't simply his actions in the assault, but it was an accumulation of altercations between himself and McClernand that prompted the Army commander to rid himself of the politician. As the Army commander settled in for a siege, the conflict between Grant and McClernand continued. When Grant sent an aide to tell McClernand to reinforce the garrison at the Big Black River crossing, McClernand reportedly cursed and stated, "I'm tired of being dictated to. I won't stand it any longer, and you can go back and tell General Grant." After the rant, McClernand told the aide, "I am not cursing at you. I was simply expressing my intense vehemence on the subject matter." The aide told Grant about the cursing, and from then on, whenever Grant heard someone curse, he would say, "He's not cursing, he is simply expressing his intense vehemence on the subject matter." In June, a letter of congratulations from McClernand to his men on their victories to Vicksburg and the assault on the town was published in newspapers, breaking with General Grant's orders that any publications be sent through his headquarters first. The letter derided Sherman and McPherson for not attacking to draw fire away from McClernand's breakthrough, and it chastised Grant for not ordering up support. Grant confronted McClernand about the letter, and McClernand apologized for his aide not sending it through his headquarters as he was supposed to do. McClernand wagered that his political connections would protect him from Grant's wrath. However, at this point in the war, the political appointees that were important at the beginning of the conflict gave way to those military leaders who gained success in the field, and for all of McClernand's accomplishments, Grant continually overshadowed him. On June 4th, McClernand sent a letter to Grant asking him to clear up rumors and allegations that he and others, mostly West Pointers, were holding him back from getting the accolades he deserved. He also wanted Grant to issue a declaration addressing the rumor that McClernand was under arrest. Grant simply ignored the request. On June 18th, the battle between Grant and McClernand came to a climax. At 2 a.m., one of Grant's staff came to McClernand's headquarters and asked that the general be awakened. After a few moments, the staff officer was directed into a room where McClernand sat in full uniform with his sword on the table in front of him. The staff member gave McClernand a sealed envelope. The general read it. It was Special Orders number 164. After reading it, McClernand stated, "Well, sir, I am relieved. By God, sir, we are both relieved." The staff member then informed the former commander that Major General Edward Ord would immediately take command and that McClernand was to return home to Illinois and await word from the War Department. The next day, Grant informed Halleck of McClernand getting relieved and cited McClernand's congratulatory letter as the reason why. Grant would write to another that the change is better than 10,000 reinforcements. McClernand's dismissal from the Army came with varied opinions. Of course, some of his men loved him, but even with them, he had seemed to want glory more than simply victory. However, it was his interactions with the higher command of the Army of the Tennessee that ruffled the most feathers. Most saw him as egotistical and seeking notoriety, which caused consternation within the Army. Although he won battles and helped spearhead the Army on the Vicksburg campaign, his attempts to assert his role in the papers and to political officials drew ire from the other corps and division commanders, as well as the Army commander. By June 23rd, McClernand arrived in Illinois, and he sent off telegrams and letters to Abraham Lincoln, hoping to be reinstated. In the letter, he informed the president that a conspiracy to deny him the credit he deserved had been ripped from him by West Pointers, and that for his adjutant's failure to send Grant a copy of the congratulatory letter, he had been relieved. Lincoln would not accept the pleading of McClernand. When Grant sent his report of the campaign in July, as one historian stated, he castigated McClernand for his performance at Port Gibson, Champion Hill, and Vicksburg. With the capture of Vicksburg, Grant rose to a great opinion in many Northerners' minds and the president's. McClernand would be fighting a steep uphill battle if he wanted to save his reputation. McClernand tried many ways to get back into the Union ranks. He petitioned the president and his entire cabinet in one form or another to be reinstated. McClernand even tried to conspire with Postmaster General Montgomery Blair to oust Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, but Blair wanted nothing to do with the matter. On August 12th, Lincoln responded to McClernand. He basically stated that he could not reinstate McClernand without forcing the removal of Grant as commander, plus he had no command to offer McClernand. This was not an easy choice for Lincoln. He stressed over the McClernand-Grant affair, but would not give in to McClernand's demands. Lincoln told the Illinois politician that no court of inquiry would be called because it would take too many good generals out of the field, but if a moment arose where they could safely be spared from the front line, he would hold that court of inquiry. McClernand also corresponded with numerous former subordinates, assembling evidence that his men had indeed made it to the rebel works at Vicksburg and captured some of their fortifications. This way, he would challenge Grant's accusations about false reports and attempt to correct the misinformation. By October, he also filled 19 pages with a defense of his ability as a commander and challenges against the abilities of Grant. In part, it read, "How far General Grant is indebted to the forbearance of officers under his command for his retention in the public service so long, I will not undertake to state unless he should challenge it. Neither will I undertake to show that he is indebted to the good conduct of officers and men of his command for the series of successes that have gained him applause rather than to his own merit as a commander, unless he should challenge it too." Nothing was coming of his allegations against Grant, but McClernand persisted, and political developments seems to have led Lincoln to put him back into command. On the domestic side of politics, Lincoln feared losing the 1864 presidential election, especially if he could not garner enough votes in Illinois. In his home state, McClernand still possessed a lot of political power, and it seems as though this was a major factor in putting McClernand back in command. After the fall of Vicksburg, McClernand's 13th Corps was reassigned to Louisiana and Texas, under the command of Nathaniel Banks, who sent some of those troops on an invasion of Texas, all the way to Brownsville in response to France putting troops in Mexico City. McClernand was elated to hear the news of him taking command of the 13th Corps again, and left Illinois on February 2nd, arriving in New Orleans on February 15th. On February 23rd, McClernand officially took command of the 13th Corps by replacing General Ord. By March, he traveled to southern Texas, where he was to control part of the state's coast and its frontier with only a small portion of his 13th Corps. 2 divisions had been sent to assist Banks on the Red River campaign. McClernand engaged in securing communications through his jurisdiction and fortifying pivotal locations. One of the most important of those locations was Brownsville because of its proximity to Mexico. Union scouts reported that Confederate officials were still in the area and were trading cotton with Mexico across the border. When McClernand visited Brownsville in April, he met with Juan Cartina, the governor-general of the state which bordered Texas across from Brownsville. Cortina was known as a cattle rustler, bank robber, extortionist, and murderer. He killed the bandit ruler of the area in 1863 and declared himself governor and did business with both the United States and the Confederacy. McClernand sent a stern letter to Cortina insisting that he stop trading with Confederates. Cortina allegedly sent the letter to the President Benito Juarez. Although not wholly taken in by Cortina, McClernand believed that the governor-general would side with the Union if given the choice. Around the same time that he was conversing with Cortina, Banks sent him an order instructing him to bring some of his garrisoned infantry to New Orleans, then proceed up to Alexandria. Banks had been defeated at Mansfield and Pleasant Hill and wanted McClernand to take command of the 13th Corps on the expedition. At Alexandria, the Union forces were in a dangerous situation. Porter's gunboats were trapped by shallow water, and Banks resolved to entrench around Alexandria. In late April, McClernand got malaria, and on May 1st, he put Brigadier General Michael Lawler in command of his corps while he recovered. He would not have a speedy recovery. McClernand had to return to Illinois. His corps would be divided up throughout the department. Upon returning to his home state on leave of absence, he recovered sufficiently enough that by July he petitioned to be given an independent command along the Mississippi River from Memphis to New Orleans. However, he would not hear back from Washington. He remained in a limbo state awaiting orders. In the fall, he campaigned for presidential candidate George McClellan against Abraham Lincoln, and on November 23, 1864, he submitted his resignation from the Army. He cited his ability to do more for the war effort as a civilian than as an unused general. He would write, "The personal relations borne towards me by officers in the military service who are my superiors in rank and influence render my future usefulness in my military capacity contingent and uncertain. My retirement from the military service would relieve both them and me from any further embarrassment growing out of these actions. When Lincoln was assassinated, the president's body left on a train from Washington, D.C. on April 21st, with McClernand aboard, along with Richard Yates. They would accompany the body all the way to Springfield, and during the funeral process, McClernand would lead a division. At the funeral, it was McClernand who delivered the eulogy, stressing the ability of the Union to come back together. He also declared his faith in the new president, Andrew Johnson, to lead the country. With the war coming to a close, McClernand would return to his political and domestic life in Illinois, raising his children and still defending his reputation. In April 1866, a full year after the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant, McClernand's son Edward, who had accompanied his father on many of his father's campaigns, sought appointment to West Point Military Academy. McClernand wrote to his representative to secure his son a spot, but the representative suggested that he obtain an at-large appointment from President Johnson. McClernand did so, and that summer, Edward entered the academy and would graduate in 1870. In September of 1866, President Johnson, General Grant, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, and Secretary of State William Seward visited Springfield. McClernand organized the welcoming committee and was a part of the group of prominent Illinoisans to welcome the president to the state. This was the first time since the Vicksburg campaign that McClernand and Grant had spoken. No account exists about their interaction on this visit, but it undoubtedly was cold. As Andrew Johnson received backlash from his moderate stance toward Reconstruction, McClernand put all of the support he could muster behind the Democratic president. He battled against radical Republicans, but could do nothing more than affirm his support to the president. When the presidential election of 1868 came up, McClernand attended the Democratic convention, and they supported him for vice president under Horatio Seymour to run against Grant, but McClernand declined to run. Back in Illinois, newspapers who previously supported McClernand began to critique him harshly for his lenient stance toward the South. The general had declared that the South committed the most heinous crime in history since the crucifixion of Jesus, but now he had shaken hands with former Confederate General Wade Hampton. The newspaper called McClernand inconsistent and a hypocrite. McClernand continued his feud with Sherman, who critiqued McClernand harshly in his memoirs. That work sent the Illinois general into a tirade of letter writing and snide remarks during political speeches, criticizing Sherman's military ability and mental capacity. In a speech to the Society of the Army of the Tennessee, McClernand said, "This excitability, combined with an abnormal egotism, sometimes interpreted as insanity, disqualified him to see men and things in a clear light." Although not seeking office, McClernand worked for the Democratic Party on the local and national levels. He was a huge supporter of Samuel Tilden in the presidential election of 1876, and continued to pressure Tilden to become the face of the Democratic Party after Rutherford B. Hayes obtained the presidency. Not all was politics. McClernand continued to have a successful law career in Illinois. He also became active in various Union veteran groups, supporting bills and politicians who sought to help Union soldiers. He purchased 2 racehorses and hired men to train them and race them to add to his income. In 1886, McClernand received an appointment from President Grover Cleveland to become a commissioner of the Utah Territory. McClernand had run-ins with the Mormons while in Illinois and actually supported the chartering of a Mormon town in Illinois, hoping to contain the spread of the religion and the polygamy that came with it. As a commissioner, McClernand's duty was to limit Mormon control over the territorial government, get rid of the practice of polygamy, and make a path for non-Mormon representation in the state. The commission recommended in 1888 that all Mormons be disenfranchised until they agreed to stop practicing polygamy. McClernand broke from the other commissioners and refused to sign the recommendation. He wrote a minority report stating that polygamy was grounds for disenfranchisement, but that simply being Mormon was not. He argued that that law would be unconstitutional, going against the First Amendment and the free exercise of religion. Because not all Mormons were polygamists, he believed this was the wrong way to go about fighting polygamy. In October 1890, the General Conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints abolished the practice of polygamy. McClernand felt it was genuine and signed off on placing no more restrictions on the territory, but the other commissioners felt that it was all an act to get their rights back. In 1894, McClernand left the commission when Congress passed a law requiring all members of the commission to be Utah citizens. In 1888, McClernand chaired a Citizens Committee to honor former First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, who had passed away. Both his wives knew and cared about Mary, and he had worked with Lincoln since their days in Illinois up until his death. In her husband's memory, McClernand attributed to Lincoln the role of savior of the Union. He held no animosity toward the president. McClernand saw him as the man who helped bind the United States back together. For the last several years of his life, McClernand was ill, unable to do much in the way of earning a living. In January 1900, Congress passed a bill granting McClernand $100 a month as a pension. The payments would be short-lived. He had been confined to a bed in February of that year, and on September 20th, 1900, the old general passed away. He laid in state in his home on 6th Street, dressed in the uniform of a major general, and on September 23rd, he was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery. His wife would live another 31 years, passing away in January 1931. One of his biographers stated, "The strength of his own will and his confidence in his own ability and that of his soldiers allowed him to overcome fear of bodily harm." The politician McClernand had responded to challenges all of his professional life. The ultimate challenge for the soldier McClernand was combat. He had been stimulated by political difficulties, and his ability to overcome those difficulties had led to success. A personality that responded to the challenges and difficulties in the political arena was apt to accept those of the battlefield and respond similarly. Ambition, oratory, determination, confidence, and courage were John McClernand's heart and soul. John McClernand had his faults. He made some tactical mistakes as commander, but won victories and helped ensure the success of the Army of the Tennessee. The politician in him went against what was expected of a soldier. Combine that with his ambition and determination to gain as much fame as possible through his military successes, made him butt heads with West Pointers, who may have been jealous of his rise through the military ranks. Nevertheless, he did not make friends with his superiors, and this would become part of his downfall, not any military defeat. McClernand fought to preserve the Union before the Civil War, and when the Civil War broke out, he joined the Union Army to ensure its cohesion. Without regard for his own life, he led troops through numerous campaigns and battles and looked out for their well-being, all in the name of preserving the Union. For that, he should always be remembered as a patriot.